Okay, folks. Well, thank you very much for deciding to spend a little time with history this morning and the latest chapter in our Hero Tales. Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge's great book about what it means to be an American. That's really the theme of the book. And the vignette that we approach today is the death of Stonewall Jackson. And I love the engraving I found for my background today. It's called Prayers in Stonewall's Camp. And you see the man himself, right now, I'm mirrored here. The man himself right there. And they've opened, as always, with a little verse, just a couple of lines this time from Macaulay. And Macaulay was a poet the Victorians absolutely loved to quote. Wade Hampton quoted him in his last message. The lays of ancient Rome were popular, but this one is not about the lays of ancient Rome at all. The little quote, like a servant of the Lord, with his Bible and his sword, our general rode among us to form us for the fight. Roosevelt and Lodge did not choose to quote the more famous poem, the one that became a song regarding their subject today, Stonewall Jackson, but it's almost irresistible to quote Stonewall Jackson's Way. We see him now, the old slouch hat cocked over his eye askew, the shrewd, dry smile, the speech so pat, so calm, so blunt, so true. Jackson was a man who made a deep impression. And as I've done every time, I'd like to step back for a second and say, why? Why this hero tale in this book? As two great American statesmen and historians look and say, what are the stories that make us who we are? What are the true stories that make us who we are? And this one is titled The Death of Stonewall Jackson. Now, most of our tales from the hero's tales don't have that in the title. Two of the tales so far, The Cruise of the Wasp. The Wasp, if you were with us, you will remember, was a ship that disappeared with all hands off the face of the earth after its successful cruise. But they didn't title it The Vanishing of the Wasp, The Disappearance of the Wasp. And then in another case, one of our hero tales was the story of the Alamo, which most famously, the thing about the Alamo is that nobody survived there, but they didn't call it the last stand at the Alamo, the death of the defenders of the Alamo. Why? The death of Stonewall Jackson. I think that consciously or subconsciously, they are thinking of another famous story. Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur. The basic King Arthur story that everything comes down from in our stories of King Arthur, the basic King Arthur cycle of tales, the first one written down that established the King Arthur stories, is called The Death of Arthur. And what is Arthur? What are the stories of Arthur? They are the stories of chivalry. They are the stories of a lost time of knighthood. And they are the stories of failure in a great cause, but brave men who failed, men who were flawed, but were pictures of bravery, of valor, and of virtue. So that's why I think the death of Stonewall Jackson. Let's see if you agree after I read you a couple passages from this great little essay. The Civil War has left, as all wars of brother against brother must leave, terrible and heartrending memories, but there remains, as an offset, the glory that has accrued to the nation. The captains and the armies that, after long years of dreary campaigning and bloody, stubborn fighting, brought the war to a close, have left us more than a reunited realm. North and South, all Americans now have a common fund of glorious memories. We are the richer for valor displayed alike by those who fought so valiantly for the right, and by those who no less valiantly fought for what they deemed to be the right. So Roosevelt and Lodge are not divided in their opinions of who was right in the great American struggle. They are both, though Roosevelt's two favorite uncles served in the Confederate Navy, and he was a great admirer of Confederate valor, both of the men who wrote our hero tales strongly believed that the Union cause was absolutely right. And this does not stop them. And in fact, their statesmanship encourages them to look for great examples of virtue to follow on both sides. And one of those examples they choose is going to be our General Thomas Jonathan Jackson. That we should all be free in fact as well as in name, and that the United States should stand as one nation, the greatest nation on the earth. They give as their positive outcomes of the terrible war. But we recognize gladly that the South as well as the North, when the fight was once on, the leaders and the soldiers they led displayed the same qualities of daring and steadfast courage, of disinterested loyalty and enthusiasm, and of high devotion to an ideal. So there you have it. These are the lessons they want us to draw from these stories, the virtues they want us to emulate, just as they have said in other tales: daring and steadfast courage, disinterested loyalty and enthusiasm, and high devotion to an ideal. The greatest general of the South was Lee, and his greatest lieutenant was Jackson. Now, Theodore Roosevelt also wrote a biography of Oliver Cromwell, a leader in the English Civil War. Oliver Cromwell, a stern Puritan, and like Cromwell and like Stonewall Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt is himself a member of the Reformed tradition, the Calvinist tradition. And he compares Jackson to the Puritan. No Northern general approached the Roundhead type, the type of stern religious warriors who fought under Cromwell, so closely as Stonewall Jackson. He was a man of intense religious conviction who carried into every thought and deed of his daily life the precepts of the faith he cherished. He was a tender and loving husband and father, kind-hearted and gentle to all with whom he was brought in contact. Yet in the times that tried men's souls, he proved not only a commander of genius, but a fighter of iron will and temper, who joyed in the battle and always showed at his best when the danger was greatest. The vein of fanaticism that ran through his character helped to render him a terrible opponent. He knew no such word as falter, and when once he put his hand to a piece of work, he did it thoroughly and with all his heart. In the first battle in which Jackson took part, the confused struggle at Bull Run, Manassas, we call it, he gained his name of Stonewall from the firmness with which he kept his men to their work and repulsed the attack of the Union troops. What happened there? A Confederate general trying to rally his men in this confused first battle of amateur armies. General Bernard B., trying to rally his own men, pointed at Jackson and his position on a hill and said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." That was General Bernard B.'s almost last contribution to the war. He was killed in that same battle, but not until after he'd given the most famous nickname in American history. From that time until his death, less than 2 years afterwards, his career was one of brilliant and almost uninterrupted success, whether serving with an independent command in the Valley, that's the Shenandoah Valley, or acting under Lee as his right arm in the pitched battles with McClellan, Pope, and Burnside. Few generals as great as Lee have ever had as great a lieutenant as Jackson. He was a master of strategy and tactics, fearless of responsibility, able to instill into his men his own intense ardor in battle, and so quick in his movements, so ready to march as well as to fight, that his troops were known to the rest of the army as the foot cavalry. And the hard marches that his men made in order to be in the right place at the right time, to give the push that would win battles against much greater numbers. That was their trademark, the trademark of the Stonewall Brigade. Well, the death of Stonewall Jackson will come at a Confederate triumph, again against much larger Union numbers, at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And here's how our authors depict that. Lee consulted with Jackson, and Jackson begged to be allowed to make one of his favorite flank attacks upon the Union Army. Attacks which could have been successfully delivered only by a skilled and resolute general and by troops equally able to march and to fight. It's going to be another exhausting, rapid movement to be in the right place at the right time. And there's often in a battle, you look for the holding and the hitting elements. And Lee's forces are going to be a holding element that the Union is lined up against. And Jackson's forces coming from the flank are going to be the hitting element that rolls up the Union line. It's a tough maneuver. It's a risky maneuver. Smaller numbers in the first place, and then dividing your army. The military textbooks would tell you not to do that. But these two men with almost miraculous ability to work together without modern radios or communications to pull off this risky tactic as few have. Shielded by the forest, Jackson marched his gray columns rapidly to the left along the narrow country roads until he was square on the flank of the Union right wing, held by the 11th Corps under Howard. Howard, by the way, is a general who would get the nickname from his troops, the Stonewall of the North, because Oliver Howard, like Stonewall Jackson, was a deeply religious man. The 11th Corps had not the slightest idea that it was about to be assailed. The men were not even in line. Many of them had stacked their muskets and were lounging about, playing cards, cooking supper, intermingling with the pack mules and beef cattle. While they were thus utterly unprepared, Jackson's gray-clad veterans pushed straight through the forest and rushed fiercely to the attack. The first notice the troops of the 11th Corps received did not come from the pickets, but from the deer, rabbits, and foxes, which, fleeing from their coverts at the approach of the Confederates, suddenly came running over and into the Union line. In another minute, the frightened pickets came tumbling back, and right behind them came the long files of charging, yelling Confederates. One of Jackson's quotes was, "When you charge, yell like furies." With one fierce rush, Jackson's men swept over the Union lines, and at a blow, the 11th Corps became a horde of panic-stricken fugitives. Some of the regiments resisted for a few moments, and they too were carried away in the flight. Now, in each of the accounts given by Roosevelt and Lodge of big battles of the war, they make a point of describing the valor of both sides, and they make a point here at those who stood in the way with better discipline and resisted at Fredericksburg, that not to portray it as simply a Union rout. But it is one of Jackson's great triumphs, and it is the last triumph that Jackson and Lee, that team in American military history, a team, by the way, a team very comparable in some ways to Eisenhower and Patton. Jackson is the one who is like Patton, the aggressive subordinate. Eisenhower is like Lee, the supreme commander who can deal with headquarters and the civilian authorities as well as commanding the armies, but relies on that right hand of a trusted, aggressive subordinate. The Confederates advanced in a dense mass, yelling and cheering, and the discharge of the guns fairly blew them back across the works they had just taken. Again they charged, and again were driven back. And when the battle once more began, the Union reinforcements had arrived. It was about this time that Jackson himself was mortally wounded. He had been leading and urging on the advance of his men, cheering them with voice and gesture, his pale face flushed with joy and excitement, while from time to time, as he sat on his horse, he took off his hat and, looking upward, thanked heaven for the victory it had vouchsafed him. As the darkness drew near, he was in the front, where friend and foe were mingled in almost inextricable confusion. He and his staff were fired at close range by the Union troops, and as they turned, were fired at again through a mistake by the Confederates behind them. Jackson fell, struck in several places. He was put in a litter and carried back. But he never lost consciousness, and when one of his generals complained of the terrible effect of the Union cannonade, he answered, "You must hold your ground." For several days he lingered, hearing how Lee beat Hooker in detail and forced him back across the river. Then the old Puritan died. At the end, his mind wandered, and he thought he was again commanding in battle, and his last words were, "Let us cross over the river and rest in the shade." Thus perished Stonewall Jackson, one of the ablest of soldiers and one of the most upright of men, in the last of his many triumphs. The death of Stonewall Jackson, like the death of Arthur, which doubtless both men had read, probably in the original language, is a story passed on in American hero tales to try to inspire future generations to see the courage and the fighting ability and the good judgment and the loyalty and all the other things that characterize this great leader as part of their American heritage, North or South. So I've hit 9:21. I'm closer to my 15 minutes that I always run over with this story. And our next session in Hero Tales The title coming up is called The Charge at Gettysburg, as we continue in the section of Hero Tales about a divided